outside of Concord. They came from Acton and Bedford and other places, and they could see everything that was around here. Now, when the soldiers came out, 120 soldiers were sent up over the hill a few miles up to Barrett's Farm, which is where the guns were originally being stockpiled. There were 90 soldiers here to guard the bridge, and the rest of the soldiers were in the center and in the whole area looking for guns and ammunition. They found a carriage that would carry a cannon. They set that on fire. They found the Liberty Pole, which is where we would post notices of meetings of the Sons of Liberty. They tore that down and set it on fire. But when the roof of the meeting house caught on fire, an older woman, I think she was only about 70, but she convinced the soldiers to set up a bucket brigade, and they put out the fire. So up here on the hill, they'd been seeing flames, but now they see smoke. And Joseph Hosmer yells, "Are you going to let them burn the town down?" And no one wants that to happen, but there's a lot riding here, because if I fire toward the British soldiers, I'm guilty of treason. They can hang me from the nearest tree, but then they can also take my property, and my family will be left with nothing. But it doesn't take long, and Isaac Davis, the man who was in charge of the Minutemen from Acton, says, "I don't have a man who's afraid," but he's made bayonets for some of his men. So they start marching down the hill, and the soldiers who are on the opposite side of the bridge look up and they see these colonists coming, and even though they're not in uniform, they look like they've been well drilled, and then there are those bayonets. And the soldiers come running back over the bridge, pulling up the planks, and then they realize the other soldiers who are up at Barrett's Farm have to come back the same way. So they fire a volley, a warning volley, into the river, and still the colonists keep on coming. And then more shots are fired, and Isaac Davis is killed, the man who was in charge of the Acton Minutemen, as is the man behind him. And with this, Major Buttrick yells, "Fire! For God's sake, fellow soldiers, fire!" And it's the first time a command has been given to fire into His Majesty's army. And the first fatalities among the British soldiers occurred here. So we have the grave of 2 British soldiers. It says they came 3,000 miles and died to keep the past upon its throne. Unheard beyond the ocean tide, their English mother made her moan. And the rest of the soldiers did something no one would have anticipated. They ran right back toward the center. The colonists picked up their dead and wounded. And then there was one soldier who was wounded and struggling to get back to the center. And a young man comes over the bridge. He doesn't have a gun, but he has a hatchet. And he decides to put the soldier out of his misery. So when the other soldiers come back from Barrett's Farm, they find this man with his brains spilled. They start to tell the other soldiers that the colonists are scalping the soldiers, which leads to atrocities later on in the day. Now, this monument was put up in 1836. It says it's in honor of the first forcible resistance to the British aggression by the colonists on the opposite shore. And the reason it's on this side of the river is because in 1836 there was no bridge here. This was private property. There was private property on the other side. The bridge that was here, which by the way sometimes was almost underwater, was also just a shortcut. So in 1793, a real thoroughfare was being put up a little bit further down the river. They needed a bridge, so they took the one from here and moved it, and they added on to that bridge. So there was no bridge here then until the centennial in 1875, and then President Grant was coming. So one of the merchants in Concord came up with the money to build a bridge, and it was cute. It was very Victorian. It had trellises and benches, a nice place to spend the afternoon, but it didn't look anything like the original. Fortunately, a few days after what happened here, 2 men from Concord, Ralph Earl, who was an artist, and Amos Doolittle, who was an engraver, came out here. They interviewed people. They drew what they saw. And the bridge that we're going to be crossing is modeled after one of the Amos Doolittle prints. And the river, by the way, is the Concord River. It's made up of the Sudbury and Ashugot rivers, and it flows north into the Merrimack and then out to sea. So let's go.